The morning Amara was dragged to the village square to meet her fate, the sun rose blood-red over Umuora, as if the heavens themselves were bearing witness to an injustice too cruel for words. She walked barefoot on the red dust road, her worn wrapper clinging to her thin frame, her eyes swollen from a night spent weeping into the darkness of the kitchen corner where she slept. Behind her, Mama Ego moved with the confidence of a woman who had just solved all her problems with a single transaction, her heavy footsteps echoing the weight of her greed. Chisholm, her biological daughter, followed at a distance, her face painted with indifference, her gold earrings catching the light in a way that seemed to mock Amara's poverty. The villagers lined the path, their whispers forming a chorus of pity and judgment, their eyes holding the kind of sympathy that does nothing, that changes nothing, that simply watches and remembers. Amara had lived 19 years on this earth, and for 7 of those years, since her father's death, she had been less than a servant in the home that should have been hers, treated like a borrowed tool that could be discarded when its usefulness expired. Her father, a good man who had loved her mother with a fierce and gentle devotion, had died owing money to men who did not forget, and Mama Ego, his second wife, had inherited not just his debts, but his daughter, turning grief into servitude and love into labor. Now, as Amara walked toward the village square, where Chief Okonkwo's messenger waited, with a brown envelope fat with cash and land deeds, she understood that she was not walking toward a marriage, but toward an auction, a transaction where her body was the currency and her silence was the receipt. The red dust beneath her feet seemed to pull at her with every step, as if the earth itself wanted to swallow her whole, to spare her from what was coming. But she kept walking because she had learned long ago that resistance only brought more pain, more hunger, more nights locked outside in the rain, while Chisholm ate her portion of food and laughed behind closed doors. Chief Okonkwo was a name that carried weight in Umuora and beyond, a name spoken in hushed tones by men who remembered when he had been powerful, not just in wealth, but in sight, when his eyes had been sharp enough to see a lie from across a compound, and his judgment had been feared by those who lived crooked lives. 20 years had passed since the accident, or the curse depending on who told the story, that had stolen his vision and left him wandering his massive estate like a ghost haunting his own life. His compound sat at the edge of the village, hidden behind rusted iron gates that screamed when they opened, surrounded by walls high enough to keep out prying eyes and overgrown gardens that had once been beautiful, but now sprawled wild and untamed like his reputation. He was 68 years old, his face carved by time into hard lines and sharp angles, his white eyes clouded with the milky film of blindness, his walking stick, a thick rod of carved mahogany, striking the ground with each step like a judge's gavel. The villagers feared him, not because he was cruel in the traditional sense, but because he was unknowable, a man who had locked himself away from the world and seemed to have no use for human warmth or companionship. When word spread that he wanted a wife, the village had erupted in speculation. Why would a blind old man need a wife? Was it loneliness, madness, a final grasp at legacy before death claimed him? But Chief Okonkwo had made his terms clear through his messenger. He wanted a young woman, unspoiled and obedient, someone who would keep his house and ask no questions, and he was willing to pay a bride price that would erase any family's debts and secure their future for a generation. Mama Ego had heard the terms and seen not a human being, but an opportunity, not a marriage, but a solution to the financial hole she had been digging herself into with her reckless spending and desperate attempts to marry Chisholm off to a man of status. The bride price was counted in the village square, under the watchful eyes of the elders, men with gray beards and walking sticks, who nodded solemnly as Mama Ego's hands trembled with greed, while she touched the cash, flipping through bills with the hunger of someone who had been waiting for this moment all her life. The land deeds were spread out on a wooden table, documents that transferred ownership of 3 plots of prime farming land, from Chief Okonkwo's vast holdings to Mama Ego's name. Enough land to plant cassava and yams for 10 seasons without worry. Enough land to sell and live comfortably for years. Amara stood to the side, her head bowed, her hands clasped in front of her, feeling the weight of every eye on her body, as if she were livestock being inspected before purchase. One of the elders, a kind-faced man named Mazi Obi, who had known her father, approached her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his voice low and filled with regret. "Child, I am sorry," he whispered, and those 3 words carried more truth than all the ceremonial blessings that would follow. Mama Ego signed the documents with a flourish, her signature bold and triumphant, and then turned to Amara with a smile that held no warmth, only satisfaction. "You should be grateful," she said loudly, making sure the gathered crowd could hear. "Chief Okonkwo is a wealthy man. You will live in a mansion. You will never go hungry. What more could a girl like you ask for?" The words hung in the air like poison, and Amara felt something inside her crack, not break completely, but fracture, like a clay pot developing a line that would eventually spread and shatter it entirely. She wanted to scream, to run, to grab Mama Ego by the shoulders and shake her, and ask her how she could do this, how she could sell another woman's daughter like merchandise, how she could sleep at night, knowing she had traded a human life for land and money. But Amara had learned silence the way other girls learn to cook or sew, had learned that her voice was unwelcome in a house that was supposed to be hers, and so she said nothing, just nodded once and let the tears fall, because crying was the only rebellion she had left. The wedding ceremony was held 3 days later in Chief Okonkwo's compound, a rushed and joyless affair that felt more like a funeral than a celebration. Amara wore a traditional wrapper and blouse borrowed from a neighbor, the fabric stiff and uncomfortable, the color a deep burgundy that reminded her of dried blood. The compound, when she first entered it, took her breath away, not with beauty, but with sadness. Here was wealth without life, luxury without love, rooms filled with expensive furniture covered in dust and cobwebs, walls decorated with portraits of people whose faces had faded into obscurity, windows draped with heavy curtains that blocked out the sun and kept the world at bay. Chief Okonkwo sat in a carved wooden chair that looked more like a throne, his white agbada pristine and starched, his blind eyes staring at nothing, his expression unreadable as the village priest performed the brief ceremony. There were no guests beyond Mama Ego and Chisholm, who had come to witness their victory, and a handful of the chief's servants, who stood at a respectful distance and avoided making eye contact with the young bride. The priest spoke quickly, rushing through prayers and blessings as if he too wanted to escape the heaviness that filled the room. And when he asked Chief Okonkwo if he took Amara as his wife, the old man's response was a single word, "Yes," spoken without emotion, without inflection, as if he were confirming a business transaction rather than entering a sacred bond. When it was Amara's turn, her voice failed her at first, the word catching in her throat like a stone. But she forced it out, a whispered yes that seemed to seal her fate and close a door she would never be able to reopen. Mama Ego beamed, her gold tooth flashing in the dim light, and Chisholm examined her nails with bored disinterest, and the ceremony ended with a prayer that Amara did not hear because her mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere far away, where her father was still alive and her mother's memory was still honored, and she was still a child who believed the world was fair. Life in Chief Okonkwo's mansion was not what Amara had expected, though she was not sure what she had expected beyond darkness and despair. The chief assigned her a room on the second floor, a space larger than the entire kitchen, where she had slept in Mama Ego's house, with a proper bed and clean sheets and a window that overlooked the overgrown garden. He spoke to her only in instructions: cook this, clean that, stay out of my study, delivered in a voice that was neither cruel nor kind, but simply distant, as if she were a necessary inconvenience he had purchased to maintain his household. Days folded into each other with a monotonous rhythm. She woke before dawn, prepared meals that the chief ate in silence, cleaned rooms that no one entered, and spent her evenings alone in her room, listening to the sounds of the compound settling into night. But as the weeks passed, Amara began to notice things that troubled the edges of her understanding. Chief Okonkwo moved through his house with impossible precision for a blind man, never stumbling, never reaching out to feel his way, walking the corridors as if he had memorized every step, every turn, every obstacle. She would hear him late at night in his study, his voice low and conversational, speaking to someone she could never see or hear responding. And once, when she had gathered the courage to press her ear against the door, she had heard him say, "I know, you can never forgive me, but I will spend what remains of my life trying to make it right." The servants, an old cook named Mama Adana and a groundskeeper named Ameka, treated her with a careful kindness that suggested they knew something she did not, their eyes holding secrets they would not share, their warnings cryptic and unsettling. "The chief is not what he seems," Mama Adana had said one morning, while teaching Amara to prepare his preferred breakfast. "He carries a burden, heavier than blindness, heavier than age. Be patient with him, child. Sometimes the cruelest thing a person can do is live with their own conscience." Back in the village, Mama Ego's triumph was beginning to sour, like palm wine left too long in the sun. The money from the bride price had seemed endless at first, and she had spent freely buying new wrappers and gold jewelry, hosting elaborate meals to show off her newfound wealth, lending money to neighbors at interest rates that made them curse her name behind closed doors. But wealth in the hands of a fool is like water poured into a basket. It disappears faster than it arrived. Chisholm, emboldened by her mother's spending, had attracted the attention of a flashy young man named Dubem, who drove a Honda with tinted windows and wore designer shirts with the tags still attached. The kind of man who promised luxury but delivered debt. He had asked for Chisholm's hand in marriage, but his demands were steep. He wanted a dowry of 2 million naira, a fully furnished apartment, and a new car, claiming these were necessary to maintain the lifestyle Chisholm deserved. Mama Ego, desperate to secure her daughter's future and unwilling to admit she had spent most of the bride price money, began to scramble, borrowing from loan sharks who smiled with sharp teeth and made promises that came with consequences. The villagers, who had once whispered about Mama Ego's cleverness, now whispered about her foolishness, about how she had sold one girl to buy temporary wealth and was now selling her soul to buy temporary status. Meanwhile, Chisholm's relationship with Dubem was crumbling under the weight of his demands and her tantrums, their public arguments becoming entertainment for the market women who sold vegetables and gossip in equal measure. The irony was not lost on the village elders, who remembered when Mama Ego had stood in the square counting Chief Okonkwo's money with greedy hands. Karma, they said, works slowly, but never forgets an address. The village erupted with excitement when news spread that Kene Adeyemi was returning to Umuora for the annual Thanksgiving ceremony, an event that honored the elders and ancestors and brought the community together in celebration and remembrance. Kane was Umuora's golden son, the boy who had left the village with nothing but dreams and determination and had returned a decade later as one of Lagos's most successful entrepreneurs, a billionaire whose face appeared in newspapers and whose charitable foundation had built schools and hospitals across 3 states. He was 32 years old, tall and elegant, with the kind of quiet confidence that came not from arrogance, but from knowing his worth and having nothing to prove. His arrival was marked by a convoy of black SUVs that rolled into the village like a presidential motorcade, their polished surfaces reflecting the amazed faces of children who ran alongside them, their tinted windows hiding the man inside, but not the legend that preceded him. Kane stepped out, wearing a royal blue agbada, embroidered with gold thread, his bearing regal, but his smile warm, and the villagers who had known him as a child rushed forward to greet him, to touch his hand, to claim some small connection to his success. He had come, he explained to the gathering crowd, to honor the memory of his late mentor, Chief Iz, the man who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12, the man who had paid for his education and instilled in him the values of hard work and integrity. But there was another reason for his visit, one that he shared only with the village elders during a private meeting in the community hall. He wanted to visit Chief Okonkwo, his mentor's closest friend, a man he had not seen in 15 years, but who had once been like an uncle to him before tragedy and time had built walls between them. When Kino arrived at Chief Okonkwo's compound, the rusted gates screaming their usual protest as Emeka pushed them open, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with memory. He remembered this place from his childhood, remembered when it had been filled with laughter and light, when Chief Okonkwo had hosted elaborate parties and his wife had been alive, and the gardens had bloomed with hibiscus and roses that perfumed the air. Now, it looked like a mausoleum, a tomb for the living, and Keen's heart ached with the kind of sadness that comes from seeing how time and guilt can transform a man into a ghost. He was led into the main sitting room by a young woman whose beauty struck him immediately. Not the superficial beauty of makeup and expensive clothes, but the deep, haunting beauty of someone who had suffered and survived, whose eyes held stories that her mouth would never tell. She moved with a grace that seemed almost apologetic, as if she were trying to take up as little space as possible. And when she served him water in a glass that trembled slightly in her hands, Keen noticed the bruises on her wrists, the shadows under her eyes, the way she flinched when he thanked her. "Who is she?" he asked Chief Okonkwo after she had left the room, and the old man's face contorted with something that looked like pain. "My wife," he said simply, and those 2 words carried a weight that made Keen's stomach turn. Chief Okonkwo looked older than Keen remembered, more fragile, as if the blindness had spread from his eyes to his entire body, dimming not just his sight, but his presence. They talked for hours that first visit, about old times and lost friends, about Lagos and the village, about everything except the obvious questions that hung in the air like smoke. But when Kine was preparing to leave, the chief reached out and grabbed his arm with surprising strength, his blind eyes seeming to look directly into Keen's soul. "There is something I need to tell you," he said, his voice breaking. "Something I have been too ashamed to confess to anyone. But if I die without speaking this truth, my soul will wander forever in darkness." Over the next week, Kine returned to Chief Okonkwo's compound every day, drawn by a sense of duty to his mentor's old friend, but also by a growing concern for the young woman he had learned was named Amara. She never spoke beyond what was necessary, never smiled, never met his eyes for more than a second, but he could see her intelligence in the way she moved, her kindness in the way she cared for the household, her strength in the way she endured what was clearly an unbearable situation. He began to ask subtle questions of Mama Adana, of Emika, of the villagers who knew her story. And piece by piece, he assembled the tragic narrative of how she had come to be in this house, sold by a stepmother who valued money over humanity, married to a man old enough to be her grandfather, trapped in a life she had never chosen. The anger that built in Keen's chest was righteous and hot, the kind of anger that demanded action. But he knew he had to be careful, had to understand the full picture before he could intervene. It was during one of these visits that Chief Okonkwo finally unburdened himself, his confession pouring out like poison from an infected wound. 40 years ago, he began, his voice shaking, I was a different man. Powerful, ambitious, arrogant. I had everything, wealth, respect, a beautiful wife. But I wanted more. There was a woman from the neighboring village, younger than me, innocent, and I seduced her with promises I never intended to keep. When she became pregnant, I panicked. I was already married, and my reputation was everything. I paid her family to keep quiet, denied the child was mine, and sent her away. She died giving birth, Keen. She died alone and in shame. And her baby, a girl, was given to a family in Umuwara to raise as their own. The old man's tears fell freely now, his face a mask of anguish. I learned the truth years later. But by then, I had lost my wife to illness and my sight to what I believe was divine punishment. I tried to find the girl, to make amends, but the family that adopted her had moved away, and the trail went cold. I have lived these 20 years in darkness, Keen, not just of the eyes, but of the soul, knowing I destroyed an innocent woman and abandoned my own blood. Kina sat, in stunned silence, processing the weight of Chief Okonkwo's confession. But there was something in the story that nagged at him, a detail that seemed too coincidental to ignore. This woman who died, he asked carefully, what was her name? The chief's voice was barely a whisper. Adais. Her name was Adais. Kene felt his blood run cold, because he knew that name, had heard it before, in the stories the village elders told, about old tragedies and forgotten scandals. He excused himself and immediately went to speak with Maziobi, the eldest of the village elders, a man whose memory stretched back decades and who kept the oral history of Umora like a sacred trust. In Maziobi's small compound, surrounded by clay pots and fading photographs, Kino asked about Adais, and the old man's face grew somber. Adais, he said slowly, was a beautiful girl, full of life and promise. When she died in childbirth, it broke many hearts. Her baby was taken in by a young couple, Chidi and Ngozi, who could not have children of their own. They raised the girl as their daughter, loved her fiercely. Chidi named her Obiageli, but after Ngozi died when the girl was 7, he remarried a woman named Ego. And when Chidi himself died 5 years later, Ego changed the girl's name to Amara, said it was easier to pronounce, but we all knew she was trying to erase the child's history, to make her forget where she came from. The pieces fell into place in Keen's mind, like a puzzle solving itself, each revelation more shocking than the last. Amara was Adai's daughter. Amara was Chief Okonkwo's granddaughter. The old man had unwittingly married his own blood, had brought into his house the very person he had been searching for, and neither of them knew the truth. Kini spent 2 days verifying the information, calling in favors from contacts in Lagos, who could access old birth records and adoption documents, cross-referencing dates and names until there was no doubt remaining. The evidence was incontrovertible. Amara, born Obiageli, was the daughter of Adavaz and Chief Okonkwo, which made the marriage not just tragic, but legally invalid and morally unconscionable. When Kine returned to the compound with this information, he found Chief Okonkwo in his study, sitting in darkness, despite the afternoon sun outside, his face haggard, as if he had not slept in days. "I have discovered something," Keen said quietly. "Something that will change everything." He laid out the evidence systematically, watching as comprehension dawned on the old man's face, watching as shock gave way to horror, and horror gave way to a grief so profound that Chief Okonkwo collapsed to his knees, his walking stick clattering to the floor, his body racked with sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of his being. "My granddaughter," he kept repeating. "I married my own granddaughter. What kind of monster am I? What kind of curse have I brought upon us both?" But Keen, ever practical despite his own shock, was already thinking ahead. "This can be fixed," he said firmly. "The marriage can be annulled. But more than that, this can be made right. She is your heir, Chief. Your blood, everything you own, should be hers by right." The old man looked up, his blind eyes seeming to focus with sudden clarity. "Yes," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Yes, I cannot undo the past, cannot bring back her mother, or restore the years I stole from both of them. But I can give her what is rightfully hers. I can give her the future I denied her mother." It was then that Amara, who had been standing outside the study door, having brought tea she had never delivered, pushed the door open with shaking hands, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief and dawning understanding of the conversation she had overheard. The village meeting was called for the following day, and every resident of Umuwara who could walk gathered in the community hall, their curiosity piqued by the mysterious summons from Kine Adeyemi and Chief Okonkwo. Mama Ego arrived in her finest wrapper, her face painted with smug satisfaction, assuming she was being honored for some reason, perhaps for her generosity in giving Amara such a prestigious marriage. Chisholm came too, bored and restless, checking her phone constantly for messages from Dubem that never came. The hall buzzed with speculation until Kine stood and raised his hand for silence, his presence commanding immediate attention. "We are gathered here," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "because a great injustice has been uncovered, and because the truth, no matter how painful, must always be brought into the light." Chief Okonkwo stood beside him, his walking stick planted firmly on the ground, his bearing dignified, despite his obvious emotional turmoil. Kine proceeded to tell the story, all of it, from Chief Okonkwo's affair with Adaize 40 years ago, to her death in childbirth, from the adoption of her baby by Chidi and Ngozi, to the revelation that Amara was that baby, Chief Okonkwo's granddaughter, his own blood unknowingly married to him, because of Mama Ego's greed and deception. The hall erupted in gasps and shouts, people turning to stare at Mama Ego, whose face had gone from smug to ash gray, whose hands gripped the edge of her bench as if it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. "This marriage," Keen continued, "is invalid in the eyes of God and law. But more importantly, a grave wrong has been done to this young woman, who has been treated as property, sold like merchandise, denied her birthright and her dignity." Chief Okonkwo stepped forward then, his voice strong despite the tremor of emotion. "I hereby renounce this false marriage," he declared. "Amara is not my wife, but my granddaughter, and as such, I declare her my legal heir. Half of all I own, my lands, my wealth, my properties, is transferred to her name immediately, with the remainder to follow upon my death. The silence that followed was absolute, so complete that the sound of Mama Ego's sharp intake of breath echoed through the hall like a gunshot. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, her face contorted with panic and rage. "This is a lie," she shouted, her voice shrill and desperate. "A scheme to steal what is mine. I paid for that girl, fed her, clothed her. She owes me everything." But the villagers were no longer listening to her. Their attention fixed on Amara, who stood near the front of the hall, looking small and overwhelmed, tears streaming down her face as the weight of the revelation settled over her. Mazi Obi stood and held up the documents Kine had gathered, the birth certificates and adoption papers, the evidence that could not be disputed. "The proof is here," he said solemnly. "Amara is indeed the granddaughter of Chief Okonkwo, the daughter of the late Adois. What has happened here is an abomination born of greed, and it must be corrected." One by one, the elders nodded their agreement, and the crowd began to murmur their support, their earlier curiosity transforming into righteous indignation directed at Mama Ego. Chisholm, seeing which way the wind was blowing, tried to slink toward the exit, but several women blocked her path, their faces hard with judgment. Kingni then made his final announcement, the one that would truly change Amara's future. "I am offering Amara a full scholarship to study business administration at the University of Lagos, as well as a position in my foundation's leadership program. She will have every opportunity to build a life of her own choosing, to become the woman her mother and grandfather would be proud of." The hall erupted in applause, people shouting their approval and blessing. And through it all, Amara stood frozen, unable to process how her life had been transformed in the space of a single hour. How she had gone from servant to heiress, from voiceless to valued, from darkness to light. 6 months passed, and the transformation was complete in ways both visible and invisible. Amara walked through the campus of the University of Lagos with books tucked under her arm and confidence in her stride. Her head no longer bowed in submission, but raised to meet the world eye to eye. She had cut her hair short, a symbolic shedding of the past, and wore simple but dignified clothes that spoke of someone who knew her worth without needing to prove it. Chief Okonkwo had indeed transferred half his wealth to her, but more importantly, he had embarked on a journey of atonement, using his resources to build a school for orphaned girls in Adoisi's name, a place where children without families could find education, shelter, and dignity. He and Amara had developed a relationship cautious but growing, speaking regularly by phone, her voice becoming the light in his darkness, his remorse becoming the foundation for her forgiveness. Mama Ego and Chisholm had not fared as well. The loan sharks had come calling when the dowry money for Dubim never materialized, and Mama Ego had been forced to sell her land, her jewelry, everything she had gained from selling Amara, just to pay off her debts. She and Chisholm now lived in a single room in the village, their pride reduced to poverty, their names spoken with scorn rather than respect. The villagers showed them no sympathy, for karma had rendered its judgment with poetic precision. As for Keen, he had become more than a benefactor to Amara. He had become a mentor, a friend, and perhaps in time, something more. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and shared values, on the understanding that true partnership comes not from desperation or obligation, but from choice and genuine connection. He visited her often in Lagos, and they would sit in cafes discussing her studies, his foundation, their dreams for the future, two people who understood that the greatest wealth was not money, but purpose. On a golden Sunday evening, as the sun painted Lagos in shades of amber and rose, Amara stood on the balcony of her small but comfortable apartment, overlooking the city, watching as the urban sprawl stretched toward the horizon like a promise of infinite possibility. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the red dust roads of Umuwara to the paved streets of Lagos, from the kitchen corner where she had slept on a thin mat to this room she could call her own, from the girl who had been worth nothing more than a bride price to the woman who was building a legacy. She thought about her mother, Adies, who had died before seeing her daughter take her first breath, and she sent a prayer into the evening air that somehow, wherever souls go when they leave this earth, her mother knew that her daughter had survived, had overcome, had risen. She thought about Chief Okonkwo, sitting in his compound in Umuwara, perhaps in his study, perhaps on his veranda, blind to the world, but finally seeing the truth that mattered most, that redemption is possible even for those who believe they are beyond forgiveness, that the sins of the past can be transformed into the seeds of a better future. And she thought about herself, about the girl she had been, and the woman she was becoming, about how close she had come to being buried alive in a life of servitude and silence, and how grace, disguised as chance, as intervention, as destiny, had pulled her into the light. The elders of her village had a saying, one that Mazi Obi had whispered to her on the day she left for Lagos. A seed buried in darkness will still find the light, because the earth knows what the sky has planned. Amara had been that seed, planted in grief and watered with tears, but she had broken through the soil and reached toward the sun, and now she stood tall, rooted in her truth, branching toward her future, blooming with the kind of beauty that comes not from what you look like, but from who you choose to become, despite everything the world has tried to make you.